All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and in rights. These are the words from Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And for me, these words are a fact, a vision, a challenge. A fact, because I believe that's exactly how we are born, free and equal. A vision, because we have so far to go to realize that fact in reality in our world. And I'll come back in just a few moments to why I see the words as a challenge. But let me begin by sharing with you some memories from my life of when I've seen the astonishing power of human rights to transform lives. Way back, I was in Bosnia during the war there, and I saw how human rights standards and human rights institutions played such a central role in establishing the peace. A few years later, I was in Sierra Leone during the civil war there, and I saw how legal arguments, human rights arguments, made by my colleagues and myself helped save lives, helped, for instance, save people from being executed. Again, some years later, I worked in Northern Ireland. There I saw how a police force that was once seen as an instrument of oppression was transformed by putting human rights at its corporate heart. All of us every day see how our societies are changed by human rights. Take my own country, Ireland. Time and time again, it was a judgment of the European Court of Human Rights that changed my society for the better. For instance, for the decriminalization of same-sex sexual activity. And then in 2022, we saw how the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to a group of activists from Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia who were fired up by human rights, by its vision, driving them in their vital work. But what is this human rights that I'm speaking about? Well, it's a very old story, long in development. You could go back to 2,500 years ago in Persia to see the origins of human rights. But the key date for us today is, of course, the 10th of December, 1948, with the adoption by the United Nations General Assembly of that Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted from a draft that was put together by authors from across the world. And there followed then, from the declaration, all of those treaties and institutions that we see today here in Europe and across the world. You can sum up the essence of this human rights machinery with four foundational principles. The first is that human rights engage all of our lived experience, all aspects of our lives. For sure, it's about freedom of speech, it's about privacy, but it's also about our socioeconomic well-being. It's about basic issues of social security, shelter, and healthcare. The second dimension is that while some rights are absolute, you can never be enslaved, for instance, nevertheless, most rights are subject to limitation in the public good. And this is essential if we're to have societies and communities. We all saw how we had to limit our own rights in the context of the COVID pandemic. A third very important dimension of the modern-day human rights system is that it is law. It is binding on states. It imposes duties on governments. That means that you can go into a courtroom and have your rights stood up for by the judges. And then the fourth and the final dimension of these basic principles is the unique quality of the human rights system. There's nothing else like it. It is the only universally shared roadmap or language to show the way to honor human dignity, human values in our societies. Or to put it another way, there is no plan B. Well then, what then of this astonishing achievement today? Where is it in confrontation with the enormous challenges we see in our world? This is arguably the most challenging moment for our human rights that we've seen in many generations. We have the war in Ukraine, the horrors that it is inflicting for the people of Ukraine, as well as for people right across the world. You have the story of COVID, not just the disease, the pandemic, but also our own responses to it. We're in the end days of the climate crisis. Our future is at stake if we don't move quickly and smartly. We have a rampant crisis of disinformation across our societies, lies driving debate with terrible consequences for our institutions. We're only now recognizing the legacy of colonialism and how so many of the problems we confront in the world today are in part because of that colonial history. And very closely related to that, we have shocking levels of inequality. The poor getting ever poorer, the rich getting ever more distant from the very poor. And so then, in this moment of grave crisis, where is human rights? And I'd have to say to you that to at least some extent, it's missing in action. We do not see human rights at the center of the responses to fix our societies and to advance them. Very often we see governments treating human rights like a buffet. I'll take those rights, that's useful. I'll leave those rights behind on the buffet, they're just inconvenient. Still worse, we're seeing, and this is new, a rejection of rights from some politicians and even some governments saying, well, I don't believe in those rights. We will no longer stay committed to that treaty. Another problem we see today is that human rights is often presented as an ideology, something strange, something to be controlled, something to be marginalized. And then when we go to our streets, I'd have to admit that for most people out there on the street, what are human rights? Well, there's something vaguely good, but they're not about me. They're not about my family. And so we've got a big job to do. We have got to find ways to restore the promotion and protection of human rights, engage the law and the institutions for the well-being of our society in this moment of grave crisis. Let me share with you 4 shout-outs on what we need to do now. The first is we have to wake up. We have to acknowledge what's at stake, what's at risk. The great French intellectual Stéphane Hassel said on exactly this topic, he said, indignez-vous, get furious. Do you realize what you're losing? And so the first thing then is wake up. The second thing we need to do then is wise up. We need to go back to human rights, get familiar with them again. If you read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights once, pick it up and read it again. Let's get human rights back into our schoolroom so that our children can learn about this extraordinary achievement. And then once we've wised up, we need to act up. We need to frame our claims for a better, fairer, more just society using the categories, the language of human rights. What would that look like in practice? Well, take one of the most important issues for today, artificial intelligence. It's an astonishing development in our lives. It carries vast potential for human well-being, for thriving societies. But also, if it's not tamed, if it's not properly directed, enormous damage for us and for our communities. Enormous damage, in other words, for the protection of human rights. So a human rights approach then to making our claims there is one where we insist that the tech industry knows about human rights, not just about privacy, but of all the impacted rights. It requires that the industry test every application in every use context to see to what extent it might impinge on human rights. It requires that we demand to have strong institutions to oversee the use of artificial intelligence, overseeing bodies with the capacity, the resources, and the knowledge to stand up for our human rights in the AI context. And of course, it demands that AI be transparent, so that we know when our rights have been affected and we can go somewhere to claim a remedy. But then to act up, we have to do another thing. We have to join up. Human rights is about and for all of our society, and therefore the whole society has to work together to achieve respect for those human rights. Take AI again. If it was left just to the human rights gang, people like me, then we would not be successful. We need to sit together with the tech people, with the industrialists, with the scientists, even with philosophers, to figure out what the problems are and what the fixes look like. Then we'll have success. There's one further dimension of joining up that I would mention this afternoon, and that is the extent to which human rights can play a role in joining us up across generations. A lot of trust has been lost in recent times. Younger people don't trust my generation because they see quite correctly that we've let them down. Older people don't trust any of us because they feel that they've been overlooked, forgotten, pushed to the side. But this shared universal language of human rights, which unites us all, can, I would argue, provide the vocabulary for us to work across all of those generations to build a better society. But my friends, let me leave you with a word of hope. I believe that we can reclaim the center ground for human rights. I believe that what was achieved in 1948 and all the years since then has gone too far to be completely reversed. But also, I draw hope from my personal experiences. I shared memories with you earlier of hopeful moments in my career. Let me finish with just one more. About 15 years ago, with a group of my colleagues, I was very upset and worried about the extent to which members of the LGBTI communities were not having their basic human rights respected. And so we set about to do a map of the ways in which the existing human rights commitments, nothing new, the existing human rights commitments applied to the lived experience of members of the LGBTI communities. We distilled these into a set of principles. They were published, they were quite impactful. But the memory I want to share this afternoon is that of a gay blogger who posted a few days after the principles were published and said, "Yesterday, I did not exist. Now I've read these principles. Today, I am a human being." It's memories like that that keep me going. It's memories like that that convince me that we can indeed realize the vision of a world where everyone is free and equal in dignity and in rights. Thank you.